legends, and welcome to Unbeatable You, where we connect, thrive, and conquer. I'm your host, Brett Robbo, and I'm super grateful for your valuable time. So let's just dive straight in. Keep thriving and enjoy. Dr Arne Rubinstein, former medical doctor, founder of the Rites of Passage Institute, author, and leader of a globally recognised leader of these much needed rites of passage. I'm super grateful to be here in your company again, in a place where when I was first introduced to you, I actually came here and did your level 1 leadership training and recorded a podcast here with you as well. And that was just before I went through a major rite of passage on my own, which was the birth of my first child, Oliver. So that was 4 years ago now, just over 4 years ago. And this time is pretty special again because I'm also joined by Nathe, Nathe is joined by me as well as we come here and collaborate together. The podcast, Nathe is, so for all my listeners, Nathe is the host of the Conflab podcast. And here we are, very mindful of your time and super grateful that we can both absorb your wisdom in this one recording.
Yeah. Well, I'm extremely happy to have both of you here. Thanks for coming.
Hey, we wouldn't have missed it. Before we dive too far deeper, can you just give us a snapshot of what a rite of passage is so all our listeners can get an understanding straight off the bat?
Sure. Well, a rite of passage is an event in our lives that transforms us. It changes us. It moves us from one stage to the next stage. So there are some classic rites of passage. You mentioned, Brett, having a child. That's a rite of passage. You're never the same after you have a child. So that is one. But also becoming an adult is a classic rite of passage. When a boy or a girl becomes a man or a woman or a young adult, that's a rite of passage. And you can't go backwards. Becoming an elder is a rite of passage. Becoming a grandparent is a rite of passage. Getting married is a rite of passage. Dying is a rite of passage. These are all events that change us. Now, the thing is, I look at it like that life is kind of like a staircase, and we move up the steps, and each step represents a different stage in our lives. So the first step might actually be when we're, in our mum's tummies, for want of a better expression. And then we're a baby, and then we're a young child, and then we're a big child, and then we become a young adult, potentially a parent. And the thing is, all of these, we will all move through these stages. But the real question is, will we move through the stages in a healthy way where we grow and we learn and we're supported by a community and we become sort of a healthier person in the process? Or will it be a wounding and damaging event? So if I ask people, and I've asked thousands about, what was the rite of passage that transformed them from child to adult? Most people will tell me a really difficult story.
Okay.
Most people will tell me there was, they either got, they got pregnant, or there was a disaster happened, or, something bad happened to them, as opposed to creating really healthy rites of passage to help people move through these critical stages in their lives.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's changed, like a rite of passage we can't change without it. So different stages of life. So if we don't go through a process like this, what you're saying is that we may stay the same?
That's exactly right. This is, so the first sort of real rite of passage, and the one that I've been so interested in, is from child to young adult.
Okay.
And every Indigenous and traditional community all over the world would have created rites of passage to mark, acknowledge, and celebrate their children becoming young adults.
Yeah.
And when that's not done, the risk is that our psyche stays in the place of child. So our bodies might change. We look like adults. We're physically larger, and we're sexually switched on, and all of those things. But our mind is still that of a child. And in fact, you can end up with grown adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s who still think like a child and still act like children, even though they may be parents, they may be leaders of organizations and companies, they may be running a major country somewhere in the world, and have the ability to push a button that can kill hundreds of thousands of people, but they're actually still a child.
Yeah, right. And that's because they haven't gone through this process. Like I love the idea of the coming of age rite of passage myself, understanding those processes of maturing with support. So could you give us a brief, like if it was a proper rite of passage, a proper coming of age rite of passage, what would be the process through that?
Sure. Well, this is what I've actually studied all around the world. And the first thing was just discovering that every community would do that. And then they would all do it in the same way. So what they recognize is when their children, basically when they reach puberty, they would be taken away for a period of time.
Right.
So they would be removed from the community. Then they would go through the transformation, and then they would come back as young adults. They would be seen as young adults, and they would be treated as young adults. And they would have to act with the level of responsibility of a young adult. Now, some of them would be taken away in some communities for 3 years, for 3 days. Some might be a month. 3 years. In Papua New Guinea, the boys would be taken away for 3 to 5 years. That's how serious they took the whole thing.
Okay.
And when they came back, everybody knew they weren't children anymore. They were coming back as young adults. And my work has been around, so what do you have to do while you've got them away to create the transformation? And the first thing is you have to create what's called a container so that they're really, when you're away, you're away. You don't make phone calls back home. You don't drop back and visit. Your parents don't come and visit you. You're actually in a container, so you're fully in the process.
Fully separate.
Fully separate, so you've been separated. And then the elements that are in the transformation that we've recognized, we work with 4 key elements. And the first one is the use of stories. So stories are the way of passing on wisdom and knowledge. So one of the big things that adults and parents want, we want to pass our wisdom on to the young ones so they don't make the same mistakes that we made. But how do you do that? Because what we do know is they don't want to be told how to live their lives. They don't want to be lectured, but they're super interested in our stories. So if we tell them stories about when we were their age and what we did and what we got in trouble for and our relationship with our own father and our own mother, that's when they'll really listen and take in. They will learn from those stories. They will then decide how they want to be and how they don't want to be. So stories are used as a way of passing on wisdom and knowledge. They're also used as a way of building community. Because when you know someone's story and when a story is shared, that's when community is created. That's the first element. The second element is there always has to be a challenge. Rites of passage always involve a challenge or an ordeal. And in some of the communities we studied, they did some pretty radical stuff. You know, they stuck them out in the forest for a significant period of time on their own, or they made them jump off a big tower, or they had to go and hit a wasp's nest with a stick and get stung hundreds of times. They did these full-on things, and they would say that they were preparing them for the hardships of adult life.
Great.
Now, when we don't do that, by the way, the kids go and create their own.
Yeah.
You know, I worked as an emergency medicine doctor for years, 15 years, and I saw hundreds of young adults who had tried to create their own rites of passage, and often the result was disastrous because there was no elders leading them through it and knowing what they were doing. So that's the second stage. After story, we have challenge. The third stage is creating a vision for how they want to be in the future. Okay, you're becoming a young adult. What sort of adult do you want to be? What sort of relationships do you want to have? What do you want to do with your life? How do you want to show up? Are you going to contribute to the community, or are you just going to take from the community? So that's the third stage, creation of a vision. And the fourth stage is about recognizing that each of the young people is different and they all have their own unique gifts and talents, their own spirit and genius. And a really important role for us as parents, elders, educators is to help each of the young people find what is their genius, what are their natural gifts and talents, who are they, and to actually bring that out of them. And when we do that, when we separate them properly, when we share stories, help them create a vision, put them through a challenge that's appropriate, and honor and recognize their gifts and talents, their genius and spirit, that creates a transformation. And then the final stage is coming back into the community and being integrated at a different stage, which in the where we're talking about here now is as a young adult.
Sorry, Robert, you can jump in any time, mate.
I do have something, but you finish what you're about to ask.
I was going to ask the last part of the rite of passage. How important is the community when it comes to reintegration?
Critical. So rites of passage are actually supposed to be a community event. When they're done properly, the whole community is involved. And I talked about this staircase and people moving up. And what we actually need is that when a child moves from child to young adult, their parents also need to move up a step. They need to let them go on some level. They need to, know that their young adult children are going to live their own lives. And that actually moves the parents more towards elderhood. And in fact, everyone in the community has to move up. So we're all supposed to be moving up the staircase at the same time. And if we don't move up and the child moves to young adult, but the parent and everyone else stays the same, and when they come back treats them the same, the danger is we push them back down into that child behaviour. So it's a community event, and they say that rites of passage regenerate the community.
Okay.
So when a rite of passage is done properly, it not only benefits the child who's becoming a young adult, it benefits everyone in the community. And just as an example of that, I say that it's a really important rite of passage, child to young adult, but they're, marriage, as we mentioned, and death, they're rites of passage. And they're regenerative. When we go to a wedding, I went to a wedding recently, and I saw all these people I haven't seen for 20, 30 years from school. And you could see how by being at that wedding, even though it was about the two people getting married, we all came together and we're so happy to see each other, and we're catching up, and we're going to see each other again. And you can see how the community, it's a community event. Same when my mother passed away 3 years ago. Yes, incredibly sad time, but I saw people I haven't seen since I was a child. Both my parents' friends and my friends, and I keep contact with them. So the community actually needs these events. It's almost the community in a lot of the Indigenous places was almost centered around these rites of passage and ceremonial events. And when we don't have them, the community just fractures and becomes more sort of dissipated and spread out, and it's the opposite of regeneration. It sort of breaks down.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm intrigued to come back to the behaviours part.
Yeah.
What are the key boy behaviours that men still possess? Like what you're saying, we have world leaders, we have people in our community. There'll be a lot of blokes listening to this that will still be triggered into or act from their boy behaviours but might not realise it. What are the key ones that you see that boys take into manhood that are destructive?
Yeah. Well,
or not healthy?
Yeah. 25, 30 years ago when I started this work, one of my friends said, because I was working with boys to men programs then that we started up, said, well, you've got to write, what is the difference between a boy and a man? And it came down to behaviours, and we recognise that the classical behaviour of a boy, let's say a 6 to 10-year-old, is I'm the centre of the universe. It's all about me, and I want power, and I want as much power as I can, and my emotions control me. So if I don't get what I want, I have a temper tantrum. And you see 4-year-olds or 6-year-olds in the supermarket lying on the ground, yelling at mummy, I hate you, you're the worst mummy in the world, and I want a lollipop, and that's okay when they're 4 to 6 years old. But if they're still doing that when they're adults, that's actually domestic abuse. A boy doesn't believe they're ever going to die. They think they're immortal. And they also, a boy wants a mother to do everything for him, to be available all the time. That is typical boy behaviour. And they'll come home and they'll tell their mum everything they did the whole day, but they won't ask mum what they don't even consider often asking mum. So that's actually normal in a 6 to 10-year-old. But if that then translates into a man, and by the way, for any of the women listening, if we ask them if they'd ever met a man who still thinks he's the centre of the universe, still just wants power, still needs to be acknowledged all the time, can't control his emotions, and wants a mother, it's kind of almost normal. And then when these people get into positions of power, it's a really big issue. So we look at healthy man or adult behavior being, I'm not the center of the universe, I'm part of a community, and what I do affects others. And power is just not for me. If I have more power, if I have more money, doesn't mean I need to buy a bigger house and, that sort of stuff. It also means I can do more good in my community. Power should be for the good of the community. I have to be able to stand with my emotions. I'm allowed to be angry, but I'm not allowed to hit someone or swear at them. I understand I'm going to die one day, and I'm mortal, and that affects how I live my life today. And I'm not looking for a mother. I'm actually looking for a relationship, a healthy relationship. And, we've since extended that model, not only boy to man, also girl to woman. There's a whole similar model, and child to adult. But that's a big difference. And when we don't create the healthy rites of passage when they're younger, we end up with adult boys, girls, and children. You could say we live in an adolescent society, which is all, consumerism ties into that perfectly.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Would you, Robert?
No, and I think the awareness piece is really strong. After doing your work, I've brought that into the coaching that I do to kind of put that I mostly work with men, to put that to them and say, here are the boy behaviors and here what like genuine man behaviors, and identifying, let's be brutally honest here and say, which ones do you still find yourself possessing and acting from often, and what's the gap, and how can we bridge that gap? Like, what's it going to take for us to do that?
Well, this is another really important thing that, the thing about being a man, I still spend time in the boy behavior, and I still spend time, and I spend time in the man behavior. But as a man, I have a degree of awareness. So I kind of know when I'm being in the boy behavior, and I know when I'm not. And so my aim is to spend more time in the man behavior and less time in the boy behavior. And it is about challenging men. And I'll be honest, my partner, she said to me this morning, she challenged me around some boy behavior because, she was in Sydney. I rang her early. I get the text back, can I call you later? I'm like thinking to myself, no, I want to speak to you now. and then, I rang her half an hour later and she answered the phone, and I'm like, oh, if you're not on the phone, why haven't you rung me back already? And she's like, Arne, I have children. I have animals. I have all these things going on. Can I say it's a bit of boy behavior that you just want me to be available as soon as you're available? And that's not okay.
She's called you out on your own thing.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Thanks for sharing that you're human, mate.
Yeah, very human.
Yeah, us married men get that quite frequently.
I was just going to touch on the stories part. You've led these rites of passage with, I think, over 250,000 people worldwide have done your rites of passage camps or trainings. And stories is a huge part of this transformational journey. Two-part question. What are some of the most common stories that you hear come through that hit, I guess, in the the girl to woman or boy to man transition that really hit home with the kids, that you see that hit really hard? And then also, how are these short stories shared in a poor way when they're not thought about? So I just think about some of the stories that I heard from adults when I was a kid were not shared in the way that I believe impacted me in a positive way, in a healthy way.
Great question. I've got a third leg to it as well, but we'll start with the first two. So the stories that the young ones relate to the most are the real personal stories shared by adults. And so an example is when we run a camp, we have them sitting around child, adult, child, adult, child, adult. And then we get the adults to share a story, and we ask them to talk about when they were the age of the child they brought on the camp and what was their relationship like with their father or their mother. And half of them cry, especially when they're talking about their fathers, to be honest. Because they had such unsatisfactory relationships with their fathers. And the kids are listening. They'll sit there for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, because no one's telling them how to be. They're just sharing their stories. And then at the end, by the way, when we say to the young ones, if you become an adult, or if you become a parent and you have a child, what would you like your child to say about you as a parent? And the answers they give us are extraordinary. And then you realize they've really listened and taken it in. And they tell you that, I want to always be there for my child, and I want them to say that, I supported them to do what they wanted to do, and that I listened to them and did things with them and had time for them. So we get the adults on our programs sharing about when they were that age. We get them sharing about their successes and, importantly, their failures, times when things didn't go well. We talk about relationships. We talk about sex. If we don't share with our kids stories about sex and relationships, they're learning about it from their phones and through porn and believing that's real. So they're the good stories, the real personal ones. There are also some great myths that can be used. That's a bit more complex, but some of the old stories that have so much wisdom, and each person who listens will relate to a different part of that story. And they say that's the psychological signpost, the part of the story you need to look at. Even things like Little Red Riding Hood or Jack and the Beanstalk.
Jack and the Beanstalk, yeah.
Boy Who Cried Wolf.
The Boy Who Cried Wolf. There's so much in all of those stories. When stories are not done well, if we go back to the sex and relationships thing, porn is a story that's not done well.
Yeah.
And the young ones are all watching porn and they believe it's real. And they believe that's how they're supposed to be, that's what they're supposed to do. And we have seen a huge change in sexual behaviours as a result of porn. So that's a story not done well. When adults, especially men, sit around and tell their glory days of how drunk they got and their conquests and things they did, that's often not done well because it glorifies it, but it doesn't actually tell you about how it made them feel and how it made the other person feel and what was the impact of those events. So, I guess there's some sort of not done well stories.
That's, I guess, what I was talking about, that I was exposed to. It wasn't through my dad. He never shared it from that perspective. I think he probably saw that he wasn't. But the other blokes do.
Yeah.
Our mates, our peers.
And so you've got the 13, 14-year-old who hangs out with some 18, 19-year-olds and they're sharing a story about stuff.
Was mean.
But it's actually not even a true story. They're only giving part of the story.
The glorified part.
But the other part I want to add on to the story, which is really important, is that every person, and we'll start with young people, every person, we all have within us a story. We have our own story about who we are or who we think we are, and that story gets shaped when we're growing up. And a huge amount of it gets shaped sort of before the end of our teenage years. And someone might tell us that we're not good enough, or that we're ugly, or we're too short, or our legs are too fat, or we're dumb, or we're a failure, or we're never going to amount to anything. And unfortunately, a lot of young people take that on and believe it and go through their whole lives believing something that happened to them or something that was said to them as the truth of their story.
Yeah.
And if that's not challenged, that becomes a major driver through the rest of their lives and can well lead them to unhealthy behaviours forever. I work in a lot of girls' schools and we're seeing more and more suicides happening in girls' schools. And these girls have so much anxiety about having to be perfect.
Yeah.
And they talk about toxic masculinity in boys, and there's this whole toxic perfectionism thing that goes on in girls, that if I don't look a certain way, if my body's not a certain shape, if I don't have a boyfriend, if I don't get certain marks at school, whatever it is, if my hair's not a certain length and colour, there's something dramatically wrong with me. And that it creates so much stress and anxiety to the point where it can lead to depression, debilitating disease, eating disorders, and even suicidal actions. And same with boys. I grew up with the story that as a man, you have to be tough, you have to not cry, you have to drink beer, you have to get lots of girls. I mean,
that was your rite of passage.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
And I didn't fit any of those categories.
So you probably felt like there was something wrong with you because you weren't fitting into those categories, and you can start to create a story around that.
Yeah. And then people compensate.
Yeah.
And so they end up doing things that are not their truth.
Not their truth, yeah.
And then it just and then they end up getting into the wrong relationship, taking the wrong job for the wrong reason, getting with the wrong crowd, all of those things, as opposed to finding their own truth, finding their own best path, and actually becoming their best selves.
And finding their own challenges through it.
Yeah.
I remember learning about the story aspect from you years ago. So when my son was born, what we've done right from the beginning is tell him stories when he goes to bed. And so he's 4 now, my daughter's 2, and they demand that we read them a book, and then before they sleep, story, because in my mind I thought, if I make it really normal from our perspective that we're sharing stories, and obviously we're not sharing the depth of them at this age, but I wanted to make it normal that they hear and that we actually share stories in a healthy kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, when we were children, we would go away on holidays or even going to school. We'd be sitting in the back of the car and Mum would tell stories about when she grew up and her mum and where they came from and what life was like for them back then. And we would listen for hours to those stories. And I learnt so much through that. Now you see the kids in the back of the car with the headphones on and the iPad, and
they're learning their stories through a screen.
And it's someone else's story. And those stories are often aimed at trying to get the kids to buy something.
Yeah.
So,
I saw this picture recently, and I've been doing some research in the shaping of society. So when we're born and how we're shaped, and it's all what you're talking about through a rite of passage in that last stage where we're pulling out the person, who they are inside, and through story and through the other mechanisms. But I saw this picture of the trees down on the Surf Coast, which is right down south of Australia in Victoria. And the trees are bent over and their leaves touch the ground. So their trunk is straight, but they're shaped by their environment to become something that they're not meant to be. And it's so true of what you were saying about the kids as they come through that coming of age, especially the coming of age one, as important, is to unlock. And that's what I haven't seen. I haven't seen a lot of that without these processes. It's so important. Like, we have schools that shape kids in the way they think. And like you said before about porn, and how men will now take that into marriage, expecting that's going to be the norm.
Correct.
And that causes nothing but destruction. So the importance of that. But I've got one question I want to ask you about the importance. What would be the most important characteristic? One of the most important characteristics, if not the most important characteristic, everyone comes out of a rite of passage with. I mean, there would be a lot.
Yeah.
But one.
Yeah. Knowing who they are.
Yeah,
I think it really is about, in an Indigenous community, rites of passage relate to the journey of the spirit. So in an Indigenous community, they believe every child is born with a spirit, and and at each level of the staircase, so to speak, the spirit is different. And it's the same spirit, but it has a different role. So we want our children to have the spirit of a child. We want our young adults to have the spirit of a young adult. We want our parents to actually have the spirit of a parent, not the spirit of a child. We want our elders to have the spirit of an elder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm turning 60 this year. So I'm very interested in the whole elderhood thing as I move towards elderhood. And it's like, well, how do I want my spirit to be as an elder? How can I be a good elder, not just an older person, but actually an elder? So that model that I talked about of child to adult, I've extended that child to adult to elder now.
Yeah, right.
And this is the other thing, that it being a community event, the whole there's such an important role for elders. They're the ones who lead the rites of passage. They're the ones who hold the wisdom. And when you remove elders from the system, then the whole system struggles to function in a effective way.
It's just shaped by a new idea.
Yeah.
Robbo, when it comes to Arne's talking about elders, you're the younger one between the three of us. I'm not far behind
Rose
Arne.
between the thorns.
A rose between the thorns. So thinking about an elder, like, what would be your expectation of an elder in a community? I know I've known you for quite a number of years now, and trust your ability to be able to see what's good in a human. But as a young father a husband and a leader, what do you expect to have as an elder?
I'll drop the word expectation. I'll tell you what I'm inspired by with elders.
That's fair enough.
People who are living their truth. Because there's plenty of people, plenty of elders, and, you know, for me, an elder can be you old blokes, or it can be an elder that's, you know, maybe 80. And what I really respect is the people who aren't drowned by societal norms and not living their truth. And so inspiration to me is someone who understands themselves at that deeper level, but can also live that life and impact and influence the next generation.
Yeah, awesome.
I would add to that. I think that's one element of being a good elder is living your truth. But I think it's also about, I think there's a responsibility in being an elder, which is to be there for the young ones and to listen to them. And importantly, not to compete with them, but to focus on bringing up, you know, energetically supporting the young ones to find what they want to be doing. I also think an important part of being an elder is really accepting death and embracing the fact that death is not only inevitable but necessary. And that's a whole exploration that I've been looking at, especially since my mother passed away. We can talk about that or not. And then, you know, I sort of looked at some of the other characteristics of what I consider to be a good elder. And that includes, you know, not have, it's about, so for me, for example, I don't think being an elder is about empire building anymore. I think it's more about relationships and being loving and being present and letting the next generation come up, build their empires. So there's, you know, quite a few things, and it's I believe now, as I'm exploring it, that elder is as different from adult as adult is from child.
Right.
When do you classify yourself as an elder?
Ooh, great question. Well, not yet.
Not yet.
You know, they have these elders conferences.
Was that a taint question?
Yeah. They have these elders conferences on, and for about 10 years I've been receiving the invitations since I turned 50. And before I was 50, they'd have them and I'd go, why don't I get invited? And then when I started getting the invitations, I'd rip them up straight away and throw them in the rubbish bin.
I'd be with you there.
Yeah. But now I'm starting to look at them. And now I've had 3 people interested in the last month say, you should look at running some elders processes, because we don't know even how to be elders anymore, most people. And it's such an important role. So I think, you know, age-wise, it's always hard to define as an actual age, but it's when you're letting go and when you're feeling that you're slowing down and things are changing, and, you know, and if I had to pick an age, I don't know, it's anywhere from 50, 55 sort of thing. But I also recognize that I feel like there's a stage between adult and elder.
Okay.
And as a man, I'm calling it Magi, which is the Sufi word for wizard. And I believe I'm in that stage. So I've got 1 foot in man and 1 foot in elder. And the foot in man, I can still go out and surf solid waves. I have a rumble with you if you want to have a rumble. You know,
I'm on off that map for a rumble after this. Then.
You know, I've got strength, but I'm not strong like I was when I was 30. Just not. And sometimes when I go to the supermarket and they say, do you want us to carry your bags to your car? I'll even say yes. But I've also got a foot in elder. Yeah. You know, I forget things. Not that that's the definition of elder, but I'm okay now with forgetting things. I just don't have the energy I used to have, and I need to rest more. But also, you know, I have a different level of wisdom and acceptance than I used to have. So it's that foot in either side. My father, who's 93, he's an elder. He's genuinely an elder. You know, he wants to be in bed by 7 o'clock, and he doesn't want to work and build things anymore, and you know, he's just happy to be at home and with his partner, and you know, it's a completely different stage, and he knows that inevitably sometime in between tomorrow and 5-10 years he's going to die.
So you're a wizard.
Well,
Is
I
that
don't know
the
if I'm a
term?
wizard,
Magi.
but
That's what it is, Magi.
Magi. Yeah, it's a Sufi word,
Mm.
but it's somewhere in between. So child, adult, in between Magi and elder.
I want to go back to some of the behavioural aspects. And I heard you talking about there's a study that was done that showed that year 12 marks are no longer what is the determining factor of how successful kids will be in the future.
Yeah.
And what is actually necessary is 21st century life skills, things like adaptability, emotional intelligence, curiosity, a few different things like that, vision for the future. So, and when I heard that, I thought, no brainer. Makes complete sense to me. But then I also thought about why are they only just bringing that out now? Because I work with a lot of people in the middle age bracket, say between 35 and 55, that still don't possess great 21st century life skills.
Yes, and still think, so in the same way as back when I was at school, it's all about academics, then it turns into it's all about money.
Yeah, there you go.
And then it turns into it's all about status.
Yeah.
Whereas what they're saying, and you know, we say, well, the research is showing that year 12 mark is not the main determinant of your future success, whether it ever was, by the way.
Whether it ever was.
But they're clearly showing it's not, and that what we really need today is relationship skills, emotional intelligence. We need the human skills. And the people who will be successful moving forward are the ones who have those good human skills. And that sort of makes a lot of sense. And then in the adult years, instead of it being about money and power, imagine if it was about community and connection. You know, and then in the older years, instead of it being about status and, you know, trying to pretend that we're still young, it actually became about nurturing the younger community and acceptance of what is, and, you know, very, very different. And I think, you know, we sort of talked about at the beginning, I personally track a lot of the issues that are happening in the community with lack of rites of passage and childlike behaviour. In fact, I'm astonished by how many things we do, which I think are the opposite of what we should be doing. You know, when kids finish school, we send them to schoolies, which is permission to get as drunk as they want, have you know, unprotected sex, potentially losing, you know, their virginity or having sex, you know, with someone they don't know, or all these disasters that happen at schoolies, instead of schoolies being a genuine celebration of the person who's finished school, what they've achieved, an opportunity for them to think about what they want to do moving forwards, are coming together, the community, to listen to that and to support them. It could be so much better, and yet it's a disaster. I worked as an emergency medicine doctor in Byron Bay during schoolies for years. It was a disaster. And, you know, it's the same with when people die. Instead of, you know, recognising and accepting death as necessary, we put those people in a hospital, in a room, pull a curtain around them, try and deny it's even going on, you know.
Yeah.
You see some traditions really celebrate that death and spend days or weeks.
How many people, you know, their pregnancy and child, you know, having a baby is actually the most difficult, lonely, isolated time of their lives, instead of being genuinely supported by their whole community. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I feel like we just, you know, I look at with girls, menstruate, when they start bleeding and when they go through menopause, two of the most significant times in their lives, which also should be supported and celebrated, are mainly crowded in shame. And, you know, they hide the fact that they're bleeding, and they hide the fact that they're going through menopause. And with boys, there'll be similar things.
It's a great spin to celebrate those things of a woman becoming a woman, rather than and I totally agree with you, because I've seen it time and time again, where there's shame put around those things. There's a woman's going through menopause, there's jokes made about it, but we should be celebrating it. And obviously you're showing all examples of rites of passage has gone wrong. Yeah. Because that's what they are. They're still the school.
There's still a rite of passage.
The schoolies thing, yeah.
It's still, a right. And I used to get interviewed on the radio or TV every year about schoolies being a rite of passage. I go, well, it's not the rite of passage I want my kids to go through. You know, and just on that, I was speaking to someone about Sri Lanka, because I have a adopted family there, and this person is telling me how they went to Sri Lanka and they made friends with some Sri Lankans, and they were taken to a big girl party. And a big girl party is when the girls in the community reach puberty and start bleeding. They have a celebration, and it's in English. The translation is a big girl party. I don't know what it is in Sri Lankan, but it's actually celebrating that these girls are becoming young women.
Beautiful.
They're calling them big girls.
Yeah, coming of age. I don't know if, Robert, you got too much else you wanted to ask around that subject, but I wanted to actually ask you about your mother's death and the transition and the rite of passage you saw, even yourself going through with that. Because you've touched on it a few times, that death is necessary and not just inevitable, but it's necessary. And so obviously you had an awakening or you viewed it from your perspective. So I'd like to hear about that if I can.
Sure. It was a big experience for me, and
if you don't mind sharing, sorry.
No, I'm fine to share. Thank you. And it was actually during COVID. So I was supposed to be in Europe working, and thank goodness that got cancelled. And we got a phone call that my mother went into hospital, and being a doctor with the symptoms they described, and she was 89, I knew that it was, not a good thing. So actually went down to Melbourne, and I got to sit with her for a month while she actually went through her final time, and basically hold her hand and just watch her sort of her flame of life getting smaller and smaller and smaller until it was just this tiny flickering flame that any puff of wind could blow out. And just being with her for that whole month and feeling how much love I had for her and how much love was coming out of her. And she asked me near the end, she said, am I dying, Arne? Because interestingly, the doctors would come in every day and tell us how they were going to get her better and she was going to go home, and they were working on this problem and that problem and this problem. And I'm going, no way. I'm watching her spirit leave her body. I'm watching her flame, as I described, get smaller and smaller. Yes, if you can save her, fantastic. I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't think it's going to happen. And eventually, and my father was there as well, and they've been married for 60 years. And so watching his process. And then my children who were traveling overseas for a year together, my two sons were traveling, they were 28 and 30. They decided to come back, which I thought was extraordinary for them to journey around the world because they wanted to see, their nana one more time. So that was a whole, seeing them step up into it. And then eventually she did pass. And while it was an extremely sad time, we knew she'd had a good life and she'd had a full life. So there was both incredible sadness, but an enormous amount of love. And I've actually delivered babies, and I've looked after people dying. And the only time I've ever felt the energy of love that I felt when I've seen people die at home with families or with what happened when my mother died, the only time I've ever felt that type of love and amount of love is when I've been in a room when a baby's born.
Oh, wow.
And a true midwife actually looks after babies being born and people dying, because it's that midpoint. It's they're either coming in or they're going out, but the midwife marries those two parts of life.
Yeah.
So there was enormous love when my mother died that we all felt, and it was like some portal opened for a number of weeks. And my father, who's a difficult fella, became the most loving, open, appreciative man I've ever seen. And it was a huge rite of passage for him, because all of a sudden, where mum had looked after everything for him, all of a sudden he's on his own and quite helpless. And we needed to start looking after him. So his actual rite of passage was to really move to a new stage of having to be fully supported. And I had to move up. My rite of passage was to, along with my brother and sister, was to really take over looking after the family, looking after my father, managing all the, every aspect of family. So every single one of us in the family, it was a full community event.
Yeah.
And then we did something, because I come from a Jewish family, where when a Jewish person dies, you do something called sitting shiva. So for a week, you sit in the house and people come and visit you and they bring food and you share stories about that person. And we had, old cleaning ladies who we hadn't seen for 20, 30 years come, and my mother had a secretary who did the bookwork, and a number of them came, and people had known Mum over the years, and they came and they shared the most beautiful stories, and we just sat there for a week. And
so cool.
It was a really special thing.
Yeah.
And my father just sitting there listening, and the whole process was really, quite an extraordinary thing. And then I came back up here to my land, a month later, and I'm on 150 acres of forest. And I remember going for a walk out in the forest and looking at the magnificent trees on the land, and then noticing, oh, look, there's a dead tree, and there's another dead tree, and there's another dead tree, and realizing that in nature, death is not hidden away. It's mixed right in with life.
Yeah.
And then looking at all the branches and leaves and compost on the ground and realizing that all of that is dead matter. And that dead matter is actually necessary for the next generation of trees to grow up. That's actually what they grow on, the death of the elders. It's like, that was, it was big. And it was also very healing for me to see this in nature and to realize, and if we do this thing that they're talking about where people are going to live forever, does that mean no one's going to be born? They're actually life and death, birth and death are very much a part of the same process.
Wow. Mind-blowing, isn't it really?
When I hear you speak about that, and thank you for sharing that, I think about you, Nathan. You lost your father, who was very influential in your life and a big community member.
Yeah.
Did you experience a similar rite of passage and see the community come together, like what Arne's spoken about, the necessity of that part of it?
Sadly, I didn't. A big part of my father was a big part of the faith community, and they hold out so much hope. And I'm only just transitioning through a really good friend of mine just died a week ago. We're going down to his memorial next week, and that was the reason why I wanted to ask that, because I want to be aware of what actually is going on. No, I didn't experience that in myself, but it's even recently, like Father's Day 2 years ago, I remember sitting at North Burleigh on the beach in front of the headland and just missing my dad for a specific moment and going, there's parts of me that haven't transitioned through that rite of passage. And I enabled myself to do it. I enabled myself, okay, let's do this and feel my dad passing then. And that was 15 years after he'd passed. So I think what you're saying is so necessary, these ceremonies around death and these celebrations around death and celebrations around things in life that we hide and are shameful of. And then just recently, we justify death because we're too afraid to face the hardness of it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you that question when I heard you talking about your mother, is I just heard my friends just passed. And when my dad passed, a whole bunch of people stood up and gave reason why he passed, like he's done 100 years and 65 and all this sort of bullshit. Whereas at the end of the day, for me to face that properly and go through that rite of passage, I had to go, no, he's dead. And I'm going to miss him and it sucks.
Yeah.
It's fucking horrible.
Yeah.
But without actually owning that, I was not going to transition.
Yeah. Well, I was very lucky. I had the month with her beforehand.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I had the week sitting. I cried buckets of tears. I had a month down there living in the house with my father afterwards. And I was able to go through it. And I saw my brother, who's a very good man, but he's a surgeon and he was working, and so much of the month Mum was in hospital. He was working, and he unfortunately wasn't there the moment that she passed, and he was back at work a few days later, and I can see, he still struggles to talk about it and to accept it because he didn't go through that process. So how many people in life, imagine, who have deaths happen or events happen to them in their lives which they don't process properly, and then those events get stuck inside and they come out in inappropriate ways, or we drink or take drugs or do things to hold them down. And rites of passage are actually designed to help us not only to be celebrated and acknowledged for the stages we're going through, but to also really accept them in ourselves and go through them. And they are all associated with a challenge or an ordeal, because moving from one stage in life to the next is a challenge, is an ordeal. And I'm fascinated by, when it's done well, the incredible positive impact it can have. Because the other thing is, in that period of transformation, in that rite of passage time when you're separated, and so like when my mum was dying and dead, that month either side, I was separated from the rest of the world and from my normal life, everything. And in that time, it opens up something in our minds, in our psyches, and I call it what's called liminal space.
Yeah.
And in liminal space, we're able to actually see our own personal stories clearly. Wow. Or more clearly than in day-to-day. You can't see your story. The story that runs your life and your actions and your everything you do, you're not actually aware of. It's your subconscious. You're not aware of your subconscious. But in the transformation state of a rite of passage, when you're in liminal space, we actually have an opportunity to become aware of our subconscious. And when we're aware of it, we also have an opportunity to change it.
There you go.
If we're not aware of it, we haven't got a hope. So the other incredibly important thing about the moments of rites of passage is that it not only transitions us or transforms us from one stage to the other, it gives us a chance to sort of tidy up our subconscious and go, oh my God, when I was 6 years old, Mrs. Jones at school told me that I'd never be anything. That's not true. I'm going to get rid of that. Someone else told me I was this or that, so it's an incredibly important and necessary stage. It's kind of like cleaning your house every now and again and throwing out some of the rubbish that shouldn't be there and rearranging the flowers and,
That liminal space, how do you believe we can tap into that without going through a complete rite of passage?
Yeah, like everyday life.
Well, we're not supposed to be in liminal space every day. This is the thing. We're supposed to be in it periodically to grow and to review our stories. And it's actually necessary. So rites of passage and the creation of liminal space is necessary. And because it's not being created by elders and set up in a ceremonial fashion, people do it to themselves, and they look for artificial ways of doing it. Alcohol, drugs, extreme behaviors, all of those things are actually attempts at creating liminal space. And it's because it's created artificially, it's now, we call it liminoid space. So if I take, I can buy a bottle of spirits for $25. Like, first of all, who's allowed to call it spirits? But anyway, I can buy a bottle of spirits, $25.
Yeah, what a waste of a name to put spirit to.
I know. I can drink it, and all of a sudden I'm not liminal, I'm liminal. Oh, I love yous all, and it's all going to be fine. I'm going to be better. I'm going to change. I'm going to do things. And then the next day, nothing's changed except I got a hangover. Yeah. And so I want to do it again. I want to do more of it because I keep looking for that place. Or drugs. I keep looking for that place. Or extreme sports where I'm, jumping out of an airplane with, wingsuit on, which, okay, great idea, but the average life expectancy once you start that is 7 years, And so because we're not providing it in a natural way, people are actually trying to create it themselves. Yeah. Or you see in schools and universities where they create their own rites of passage with hazing and frat clubs, or in the army or in the Navy. There's more and more stuff coming out about the incredibly, unhealthy behaviors they have. It's all about trying to create rites of passage. But because we don't know how to do it in a healthy way anymore, and because it's a necessary part of life's development, it'll happen, or life does it to us. When we get divorced, or we lose our job, or we get sick, or we have a bad accident. They are all forms of rites of passage.
On that, with the rites of passage, you obviously run those programs here because you know what works, and bringing people into here and putting them through a rite of passage. Even I did your level 1 leadership training, and I thought I'm going to learn about what it is, but you actually put us through a rite of passage, and I left saying, fuck, I didn't expect that. And I came in with zero expectations, so it was good to walk away saying that and kind of experiencing that. how can these be put into society? Because you can't do it all.
No.
And although we would love to see you lead all of them with your wisdom, how can these be put into society more regularly? And obviously for the, let's say, kids to adults, so the boys and the girls, to the men and the women, and also in adulthood. So think about, in leadership spaces or in workplaces.
Yeah, everywhere, anyway. Okay, great. It's such an important question. So yes, we run some camps here, but there's a limit to how many camps we can run a year. And I do my leadership training, and I believe the best way of teaching is through a combination of educational materials and actually experiencing the process, which is why when I do my 3-day training here or anywhere around the world, we learn about the rite of passage, but we also experience it. And at the end of the day, my aim, my vision is for rites of passage to become mainstream again. They should be normal. Every teenager should be going through a rite of passage. Adults should be going through healthy rites of passage. And the way I feel I can contribute to that in the best way is really by educating as many people as possible about the appropriateness and necessity of rites of passage, because a lot of people don't even know about it and don't even understand it. And then teaching people the framework so that they understand the stages of a rite of passage and the elements, and that framework can be translated to whether it's a child becoming an adult or becoming a parent, becoming a grandparent, becoming an elder. The framework of separation, transformation, and integration stays the same. And then within the transformation, story, challenge, vision, and honoring is always present.
Yeah.
However, I need to say that how those elements get represented is different at certain stages. So just very quickly, for children, they need to hear stories as part of their rite of passage to learn and grow and get wisdom. For adults, they actually need to share their stories. Yeah. They need to get their stories out. Otherwise, the stories sit inside and they're a waste. So it's a rite of passage for elders to have someone to share their stories with. And who loves hearing stories the most of anyone?
Kids.
Children.
Yep.
That's why you get the elders and the adults together. So it's still stories, but it's just for one of them, they're absorbing them, and the other one, they're getting them out. And then the challenges. For teenagers, often the challenges need to be physical and actually life-threatening because they need to see that edge. So we need to create rites of passage that actually feel really dangerous, but in reality aren't, because we can't kill kids or maim kids. We're just not allowed to do that. But they're doing it to themselves in cars and jumping off things and drugs. So kids need that perceived risk. For me, as a 60-year-old, the challenge I need is it doesn't have to be about surfing the biggest waves I can or climbing the biggest mountains or risking life and limb. My challenges are now much more psychological, emotional, spiritual, about how do I accept becoming an elder? How do I accept letting go of youth and everything that goes with it? So there will always be a challenge, but the form of challenge is different at different stages. So what I feel my role is about educating people around rites of passage and training them in the framework, plus helping them to understand how you use the framework, but it's used differently with a 15-year-old than it would be with a 60-year-old.
So we can take that framework into, you said you work a lot with girls' schools and obviously
girls' schools,
other schools.
boys' schools, co-ed schools, companies, businesses.
Yeah.
How do you create rites of passage so that people move through the sort of the leadership process where they start as an employee and then they have some management responsibility and then they move on becoming a leader, so they don't end up running the company as a bloody dictator, autocrat, but they realize that if I'm a leader, my most important role is to bring out the gifts of those who I am leading.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's probably my study of the rites of passage, and even before knowing you and your work, that it is about leadership. It's about leadership for every person, because firstly we need to lead ourselves well.
Correct.
So without the right examples of the story, of the honouring, then we don't know ourselves well enough to lead ourselves better.
Yeah.
We
don't want to be leading from a place of insecurity.
But the world is full of that.
Correct.
and what you're doing.
Because we haven't had healthy rites of
That's
passage.
right. That's right. And what the work you're doing is incredible. And like I echo what Robbo says. How does it get out there? How do we make it further? One thing I wanted to ask or say before is you were intimating, and I saw this is a question, that there's an innate desire in all of us for a rite of passage. It's almost like if it's not there, then we're going to go and create our own. So it seems like there's an innate desire.
Innate desire, innate need, and we can recognize it. I talk about how on the staircase, you'll be on one step, and the step's great, it's working well, I'm at the right stage, and then you start getting agitated. Something's not quite right. Something's going, I've got it a bit at the moment, quite a bit, growing with how hard I'm working and what I'm doing. This is not right for me anymore. I need to be doing this differently, and I can feel it's affecting me. And the most agitated group of all are teenagers.
Yeah.
Because teenagerhood is actually a new stage we invented in the 1930s or whatever it was. So it's that space between child and adult. But what is a teenager? And when I ask them, they say they expect us to act like adults, but they treat us like children. Mm. And teenagers want the privileges of adults, but they want the...
Act a bit like kids.
Yeah, quite, act a lot like kids, So they're the most agitated of all. And what they're actually crying out for is a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And if we don't do it, they get more and more agitated. And then there's an African proverb that if we don't create rites of passage for our young, they will burn down the village to feel the heat.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I've heard that.
They need it.
So it's innate and needed.
Correct.
In all of us.
Correct.
Dr. Arne, I've not got. I want to respect your time, so we're going to wrap up, I guess, soon. Unless Robbo's got a whole bunch more.
Mate, we could keep going for days.
Yeah, I know we could keep going for days. But what's the best way for our communities, now, to support what you're doing?
Well, thank you. I mean, we have a website, the ritesofpassageinstitute.org. Rites spelled R-I-T-E-S. Rites of Passage. In fact, if you Google rites of passage, first thing you'll come to is a tattoo convention. But down below that, you'll see the Rites of Passage Institute. And what we want people to be looking at how can they create rites of passage for their own children and in their own communities. And we work more and more now in schools, supporting schools to create rites of passage. We have rites of passage programs running here at our property at Yarrakura, which is near Byron Bay. There are more and more groups who are running rites of passage, and we're happy to refer people on when we can in Australia and in 25 countries around the world. And we also do a lot of leadership trainings so that we can train people in the framework of a rite of passage. So the best sort of starting place is to have a look at our website, the Rites of Passage Institute, and to see what people relate to and how we can support them. Because, as I said before, our aim is to make rites of passage mainstream again for children, for adults, for elders. And if people want to be involved and want to find rites of passage, we'll do everything we can to support them in that.
That's awesome.
Before we do wrap up, I want to ask you, you're not yet an elder, you're a wizard. You're in this wizardry phase. How are you consistently looking after yourself? Because as a young 37-year-old, I love having people like yourselves as mentors around to go, oh, that's what 60 is. Great. I see you're super active, you're healthy, you're wise, you're driven and you're passionate, but you're also within yourself slowing down and just listening to the phase that you're in. You've served us all kombucha here today and we're drinking chai tea. I know that you grow a lot of things on your farm. You still look like you're keeping physically active beyond just surfing the big waves down in Byron. What else do you do to look after yourself?
Well, I have to say straight up, I don't know that I look after myself as well as I should.
Okay.
But I'm trying. But my particular medicine is regular exercise, good food, and spending time with people I love. You guys are coming here and saying, appreciate your time and thank you. What a gift to sit here with a couple of fellas, one who's wearing a T-shirt which has love on the front, the other one's wearing a T-shirt which has gratitude on the front, and get to talk about what I'm so passionate about and what I love doing. So there are those things. And then also, pushing myself I have to push myself to accept and acknowledge that I have to let go. And so passing things on. And also, I really love looking for events and moments that will help me just to reset. So going on workshops or, sitting in ceremonies that are happening around the place. I'm very seriously considering, in fact, I'm committed to doing a vision quest this year, which will be up to 4 days in the forest on my own, no food, no water, just, and I have both excitement and a pretty solid amount of trepidation around doing that, but it's something that's calling me. So, looking for what are the things that call me, what are the things that come up, and then when I see those opportunities, taking them.
Brilliant.
And then on top of that, practicing gratitude. I love that when, you first arrived, you said, "Oh, what are you grateful for, Arne, today?" And also, they're two good words. Gratitude, which comes up for me as a lot has been so important, and love. I think part of becoming an elder is just recognizing that it really is all about love. It comes down to love.
I agree.
And what do you mean by love?
Well, I think one of the greatest ways we can show our love is to accept someone for who they are and help them go more into that. Because, once again, I have another side of me which is critical. And when I look for and find and see the negative sides or just be critical of things, I stop seeing the beautiful sides. And I actually recognize that critical side, I call it the love assassin. And it's associated. I did a meditation around it where I saw it as a sort of a almost dead flesh with maggots eating it. And when I shut down my heart and when I go into that negative, it's a love assassin. And I have choice around whether I'm going to let that be, who I am, or whether I'm going to, look for the beauty and the love and the positive side of things, which is not to say that there isn't negativity and shadow and difficult sides of life, but love is for me about being really present, being in a place of gratitude, being in appreciation, and really looking for what is the beauty in the situation or the person who I'm with.
Oh, brilliant.
Great answer.
I love that answer.
I love that answer too.
I've said it to Nathe before on the podcast, but it came up for me over the years of finishing my journal. Things would come up and it'd just be, boom, love first, love always, love wins.
Yeah.
And it just, I love that frequency of it. And congratulations, you are human for experiencing the love assassin. And from my short time on the planet, from learning from experts that study human behavior and the way that we are as humans and the brain, that it's actually easier for us to experience the love assassin. It's easier for the human brain to find the negative things and the things that are wrong. It's actually the work that we do that is required for us to actually find the positive or the empowering aspects or the love and the gratitude. And that's why these practices are necessary to not allow us to shift in. Well, we will, but not allow us to spend much time in that love assassin, as you call it, when we do have choice to actually be able to operate from the other frequencies.
Yeah, I'm doing personal development work I've been doing it for, I'd say 40 years, but I'm discovering things about myself and it's embarrassing, what I discover. And what I do love is that I'm seeing the young ones in their 20s and 30s and it's almost like they're at the same level. And I didn't have a healthy rite of passage. I didn't get all these things. And I just feel like if we can support them to start their journey at the age of 13, 14, 15, rather than waiting until they're 40 and had a divorce and had that's evolution. So
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I love now that it's got a name, so when I see it, I can call it the love assassin.
Well, actually, Paul Taylor that spoke to you on his podcast a little while ago, he was telling us, had him on the podcast recently, that he creates and suggests everyone creates their own gremlin and their own sage, and to name the gremlin and name the sage, because the gremlin will come out.
Yeah.
And the more that you can identify what the behaviors of the gremlin are and how they impact us, what the behaviors of the sage are and how supportive they are, and also what the behaviors or the assets of the sage are that we want, that we don't possess yet, and knowing that that's available to us.
Yes,
Sage.
I completely agree.
Awesome.
Arne, you're a legend.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge you for your consistent commitment to this mission and vision of yours to make rites of passage mainstream again. And I'm always inspired by that fire that still burns so strongly inside of you. And I know, and I've had several of people who have done your programs that have relit that flame in other areas, that are creating these rites of passage in other areas because of your influence. I've put it into a majority of my coaching and taking most of my clients through rites of passage now. Even when I deliver workshops at corporate organizations, I'm looking at how to bring in stories and transformations and acknowledgements to create these little aspects. So I believe that what you're doing is definitely creating that impact. And I trust that you sharing your time and value now is in alignment with that legacy that you are not just leaving, but also living. Keep shining your abundant light to the world, my man.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Arne. It's been great.
Brilliant. There you go. Another empowering episode. And thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you check out the show notes for any extra links or information that we spoke about in this episode. Don't forget, you can now catch the Unbeatable You podcast on the YouTube channel, Brett Robbo Coach. If you want info and inspiration straight into your inbox on how to live an unbeatable life, you can sign up to receive weekly insights and actionable steps for optimal performance and thriving in every aspect of your life, plus first release offers on Unbeatable You courses and live events. Don't worry, there's no spam, just short, punchy, value-giving emails straight to you. Simply go to brettrobbo.com/community. If you find value in this podcast, don't forget to share it around with your mates and subscribe, rate, and review. It really supports the podcast mission massively. If you want to reach out to me personally, you can connect with me at Brett Robbo Coach on social media, and that's where you can let me know who you want to hear on the show. Keep thriving, legends, and as always, remember, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? This is your opportunity to live your unbeatable life.